A red dawn creeps over the Sahel, light spilling across dust and stone, and somewhere beyond the horizon, an army is already moving. Spears rise and fall with each step. Shields knock together in rhythm, and the ground trembles under thousands of feet, advancing toward a city that knows what this means. At the front is not a king, not a prince groomed for ceremony, but a woman whose authority is unquestioned, whose command is enforced not by myth, but by steel, discipline, and the certainty of death. Long before Europe wrote its first colonial report, long before outsiders decided what power was supposed to look like, African battlefields were already shaped by queens who ruled through war. Stay with this story. If you're watching now, make sure you're still here at the end, because by the time this journey closes, you'll see how entire empires were forged, defended, and sometimes destroyed by women whose names history tried to soften, sanitize, or forget. What comes later will change how you understand power itself. The camera pulls back, not to a single kingdom, but to a continent threaded with systems older and more complex than the myths later imposed upon them. Across Africa, sovereignty was not bound to gender in the way modern assumptions often suggest. Authority flowed through lineage, ritual legitimacy, military competence, and political consensus. In Kush, in the Hausa states, in Asante, in Dahomey, in Ndongo and Matamba, rulership was a function of structure, not biology. When a woman inherited, seized, or was elevated to power, she inherited the full weight of the state, including its wars. This was not symbolic leadership. These queens did not reign from shaded courtyards while men fought in their name. They issued mobilization orders. They directed campaigns. They negotiated truces with enemies who had already tasted their armies. In many of these societies, military command was inseparable from rulership itself. To rule was to be prepared to kill, to lose, to burn, to rebuild. And when women ruled, war followed not as an exception, but as an expectation. The landscape matters here. Open savannas favored cavalry and rapid expansion. Dense forests demanded disciplined infantry and intimate knowledge of terrain. River systems became supply lines, borders, and traps. African warfare was strategic, adaptive, and deeply political. Battles were not random clashes, but instruments of statecraft used to secure trade routes, enforce tribute, suppress rebellion, or deter encroaching powers. Queens operated inside this logic with the same ruthlessness and calculation as any male counterpart. In Nubia, south of Egypt, the kingdom of Kush had already spent centuries confronting imperial neighbors. Its rulers understood Rome long before Rome understood them. Queens were not ceremonial figures. They were state actors embedded in a military aristocracy that prized resilience and retaliation. In West Africa, Hausa city-states rose through fortified expansion, absorbing territory through campaigns that required relentless leadership. In the forested heartlands of what is now Ghana and Benin, war councils debated strategy, while logistics chains fed standing armies, some of them permanently mobilized. These were not fragile states waiting to be discovered. They were militarized systems already shaped by centuries of conflict, internal and external. When women ascended to leadership within them, they did not invent violence. They inherited it. The idea that female rulers were anomalies collapses quickly under scrutiny. In many African societies, queenship was institutional. There were offices designed specifically for female authority: queen mothers, co-rulers, regents, and sovereigns whose legitimacy was reinforced by spiritual and ancestral sanction. Warfare, in this context, was not masculine or feminine. It was political necessity. European observers would later struggle to process this reality. Missionaries, traders, and colonial officers often wrote with confusion or disbelief, describing African queens as unnatural or monstrous precisely because they commanded violence competently. Their reports betray less about African societies and more about European discomfort with power that did not mirror their own social codes. Yet even through biased records, one fact remains undeniable. These women ruled, and men obeyed. The camera shifts across centuries without warning. The sound of iron gives way to gunpowder. Muskets appear alongside spears. Fortifications grow thicker. Trade routes harden into front lines. As foreign interests begin pressing inland, first as merchants, then as occupiers, the test of leadership intensifies. For African queens, warfare evolves from expansion and consolidation into survival. But before resistance and collapse, before treaties written under duress, there is mastery, there is command, there is the cold clarity of decisions made knowing lives will be lost. These queens did not fight to prove something about gender. They fought because the state demanded it, because rivals threatened borders, because tribute was unpaid, because foreign powers would not stop advancing. This distinction matters. It strips away modern projection and forces us to confront these figures on their own terms. They were not symbols, they were rulers. Across regions and centuries, patterns emerge. War strengthened legitimacy when successful and shattered it when lost. Victories brought captives, wealth, and stability. Defeats invited rebellion and foreign intrusion. Queens bore these consequences fully. When campaigns failed, they were blamed. When cities burned, they carried the responsibility. Their authority was never protected by novelty. It survived only as long as results justified it. And yet, they ruled anyway. As the scene settles, the armies fade into memory, leaving behind walls, weapons, and names passed through generations. What remains is not a single story, but a framework, one that makes the rise of figures like Amina, Hangbe, Amanirenas, Nzinga, and Ya Asantewa not surprising, but inevitable. They were not exceptions breaking tradition. They were tradition acting under pressure. The wars they waged would redraw maps, provoke empires, and echo far beyond their lifetimes. And as we move forward, the focus narrows, from systems to individuals, each stepping into power with a clear understanding of what rule would cost. The earth remembers expansion long after banners rot away. It remembers it in roads pressed flat by marching feet, in walls that rise where none stood before, in cities that wake one morning under a new flag and a new authority. In parts of West Africa, this is how power announced itself, not through proclamation, but through conquest. And at the center of some of the most aggressive state-building campaigns stood queens who did not wait to be threatened before going to war. The camera opens on open grassland, the kind that invites movement. To the north and east, rival cities watch the horizon with unease because they know what follows dust clouds like these. This is not a defensive mobilization. This is expansion by design. In the house estates, warfare was not episodic. It was structural. City-states grew or vanished based on their ability to project force outward, to absorb weaker neighbors, and to control trade routes that carried salt, leather, gold, and people across the Sahel. Within this system, Queen Amina of Zadzao emerges not as a legend drifting in isolation, but as a ruler operating exactly as her political environment demanded. Hausa chronicles and later recorded oral traditions describe a reign defined by near-constant campaigning. Fortified cities fell one by one. Tribute networks expanded. Borders pushed outward until Zazao's influence reached far beyond its original core. These were not symbolic victories. Each conquest required logistical coordination, supply lines, garrison placement, and the integration of new territories through force and negotiation. Amina's authority rested on results. Expansion validated her rule. Each successful campaign reinforced her legitimacy among military elites who measured leadership in captured land and secured trade. Her armies did not simply raid and withdraw. They occupied, fortified, and moved on. Defensive walls attributed to her reign, whether built by her order or later credited to her name, reflect a strategy that understood permanence. War was not just about taking, it was about holding. The violence here is not romantic. Cities resisted. People were displaced. Defeat carried consequences that rippled through generations. But to rule a house estate without expansion was to invite collapse. Queens like Amina did not invent this logic. They mastered it. Further south, in the forests of Dahomey, expansion followed a different rhythm, but an equally deliberate intent. Dense terrain demanded disciplined infantry and centralized command. The Dahomean state was unapologetically militarized. War was seasonal, ritualized, and relentless. Campaigns supplied captives, enforced dominance, and maintained internal cohesion through shared violence. Within this structure, Queen Hangbei's reign sits at the intersection of tradition and erasure. Her rule, preserved through court memory and later colonial ethnography, reflects continuity rather than deviation. Dahomey's monarchy did not pause its wars for her gender. The state's military engine continued to function as designed. Campaigns moved outward. Enemies were subdued. The army remained the backbone of political authority. Hangbei did not rule as a caretaker. She ruled as a monarch in a system that rewarded strength and punished hesitation. The ambiguity surrounding her reign, its compressed timeline, its partial disappearance from later official lists, reveals more about how history was curated than how power was exercised. What matters is that her authority aligned with Dahomey's core principle, survival through dominance. These queens were not reacting to invasion. They were shaping the map proactively. Expansion secured resources, deterred rivals, and broadcast strength. It also created enemies who would remember every defeat. This is the paradox of conquest. Each victory carries the seed of future resistance. The camera lingers on the machinery of war itself. Spears and blades are forged locally, adapted to terrain and tactics. Command structures rely on loyalty networks built through kinship, patronage, and reward. Intelligence moves through traders and messengers long before armies march. These queens presided over systems that required constant attention. A failed campaign could unravel alliances overnight. What distinguishes these rulers is not brutality. Violence was universal. But intentionality. War was policy. Expansion was strategy. Peace, when it occurred, was temporary and conditional. This approach demanded rulers who could commit fully, because partial engagement meant disaster. Gender offered no insulation from consequence. A queen who lost territory did not receive leniency. Authority eroded just as quickly as it did for men. That these women ruled at all, sometimes for decades, speaks to sustained success rather than novelty. As time moves forward, the cost of this expansion becomes clearer. Territories absorbed through force require constant maintenance. Garrisons strain resources. Tribute breeds resentment. Enemies adapt. What once felt like momentum begins to feel like exposure. And beyond the horizon, something new is approaching. Foreign powers, armed with unfamiliar technologies and relentless economic incentives, begin probing inland systems already hardened by centuries of war. For queens who built states through expansion, the rules are about to change. The camera pulls back from the battlefield, leaving behind cities enlarged by conquest and borders stretched thin. Expansion has delivered power, but it has also created a world where every neighbor remembers being conquered, and every advantage must be defended again and again. Stone pyramids rise from the desert like broken teeth, their shadows stretching across sand that once echoed with the tramp of foreign boots. Here, in the southern reaches of the ancient world, war was no longer about expanding borders. It was about defying an empire that believed itself unstoppable. The clash that followed would not be remembered as a minor rebellion, but as one of the few moments when Rome was forced to retreat, bruised and humiliated by a queen who understood both terrain and psychology. When Roman legions pushed south into Kush at the end of the 1st century BCE, they expected submission. What they encountered instead was Amanirenas. Classical sources describe her not as a diplomat seeking compromise, but as a ruler prepared for sustained confrontation. She struck quickly, leading forces that overwhelmed Roman outposts, seized territory, and carried away symbols of imperial authority, including statues meant to project Rome's permanence. The message was unmistakable. Kush would not be absorbed quietly. Rome responded with force, sending legions deeper into unfamiliar land, burning cities, and attempting to impose fear through destruction. Amanirenas answered with strategy. Kushite forces avoided prolonged engagements where Roman discipline excelled. They exploited distance, climate, and supply vulnerability. War became a test of endurance rather than spectacle. Rome could win battles. Kush could deny victory. The conflict dragged on until Rome recalculated. Maintaining control so far from its core drained resources and morale. Eventually, negotiations followed, not as a Roman concession framed in humility, but as a practical retreat. The resulting treaty favored Kush. Borders were stabilized. Tribute was abandoned. Amanirenas had not defeated Rome in a single decisive clash. She had made conquest unprofitable. Centuries later, and thousands of miles west, another queen would face a different empire, armed not with legionary shields, but with gunpowder, contracts, and missionaries. The Portuguese arrived in Central Africa with the language of trade and salvation, but behind it lay expansion and enslavement. Ndongo and Matamba sat directly in their path. Queen Nzinga understood immediately that survival required adaptation. She negotiated when it bought time. She fought when negotiation failed. Portuguese correspondence records her as infuriatingly resilient, breaking agreements, shifting alliances, and refusing to be fixed in one role. She was baptized when it served diplomacy. She returned to traditional authority when it strengthened internal legitimacy. War and politics became inseparable. Nzinga's campaigns were relentless. She reorganized armies, incorporated displaced peoples, and transformed Matamba into a militarized refugee state. Portuguese forces could take cities, but they could not end her resistance. Decades passed. Governors changed. Commanders rotated home. Nzinga remained. What made her dangerous was not just force, but understanding. She exploited rivalries between European powers. She leveraged terrain that frustrated conventional warfare. She turned the instability caused by the slave trade into manpower and loyalty. Resistance became sustainable because it evolved. The camera moves between these two queens, separated by centuries, yet bound by pattern. Both faced empires convinced of their own inevitability. Both refused direct submission. Both forced their enemies to confront limits they preferred not to acknowledge. But resistance extracts a price. Cities burn, populations scatter, armies thin. Victory, when it comes, is measured not in conquest, but in survival. Amanirenas preserved sovereignty, but Kush would never again ignore Rome's shadow. Nzinga outlived her enemies, but her lands remained scarred by continuous war and depopulation. These queens did not halt history. They bent it. They delayed domination long enough to expose the fragility behind imperial confidence. Their wars were not glorious. They were exhausting, strategic, and morally complex. Fought not for triumph, but for the right to continue existing on their own terms. As the camera drifts away from battlefields and treaties, the question shifts. What happens when war no longer stays at the front? When resistance demands not just soldiers, but entire societies? When leadership requires pulling civilians into the furnace? That answer waits in the forests of Asante. The forest does not announce war the way open land does. It absorbs sound, swallows distance, and forces armies to fight blind. In the heart of Asante territory, this landscape had always been an ally, slowing invaders, protecting supply routes, and turning every path into a potential ambush. But when war returned at the turn of the 20th century, it was no longer just a contest of weapons. It became a test of collective will. By this point, the British were no longer probing. They were asserting. Colonial administration demanded submission not only to authority, but to symbolism. The golden stool was not simply a royal object. It embodied the spiritual and political unity of the Asante people. To touch it without sanction was to violate the state itself. When British officials demanded access to the stool, resistance hardened instantly. Councils met. Voices argued. Some favored caution. Others recognized that compromise here would mean permanent erosion of sovereignty. Into this fracture stepped Ya Asantewa. Her authority did not come from coronation. It came from urgency. Oral records and colonial reports alike describe her intervention as catalytic, an appeal not to nostalgia, but to survival. She framed the conflict not as a final stand of old power, but as a moral line that could not be crossed without consequence. If the men would not fight, she said, then the women would. Mobilization followed. Villages emptied of fighters. Supply lines were improvised under constant threat. The war that erupted was uneven from the start. British forces possessed artillery, machine guns, and reinforcements that could be summoned from beyond the forest. Asante resistance relied on terrain, numbers, and conviction. The siege of Kumasi became the war's defining image. The city, once a center of regional power, was encircled. Fighting dragged on, not for days, but months. Food ran short. Disease spread. Civilians were no longer bystanders. They were targets, carriers, casualties. Leadership meant choosing who would suffer and how long resistance could be sustained. Ya Asantewa remained. British accounts note her presence not as symbolic, but operational, issuing orders, coordinating defense, maintaining morale under conditions that broke others. This was not a war of conquest. It was a war of refusal. When it ended brutally. The British prevailed. Kumasi fell. Ya Asantewa was captured and exiled, removed not because she was a queen, but because she was effective. The cost was staggering. Lives lost, infrastructure destroyed, autonomy dismantled. And yet, something endured. The war marked the final assertion of Asante sovereignty, but it also exposed the reality of modern empire. Firepower could win territory, but not legitimacy. British rule would face persistent resistance long after victory was declared. Ya Asantewa's leadership transformed defeat into memory, and memory into political identity. This is the paradox of war led from necessity rather than ambition. Loss does not erase meaning. Failure does not negate courage. The cost paid by civilians and fighters alike becomes part of the state's moral ledger, shaping how future generations understand power, resistance, and sacrifice. As the forest grows quiet again, the camera pulls upward. Across Africa, the age of independent warfare led by sovereign queens is closing. Colonial systems tighten. Borders harden. Authority is increasingly dictated from afar. What remains are stories stripped of simplicity. Queens who expanded states through conquest. Queens who defied empires through endurance. And queens who mobilized entire societies, knowing the outcome might still be defeat. The final question is not whether they won or lost. It is what survived after the fighting stopped. Silence settles where armies once stood. Grass grows over trenches. Palaces become administrative offices. Names that once carried command are reduced to footnotes, mispronounced or dismissed as legend. This is how war often ends, not with clarity, but with quiet erasure. By the early 20th century, Most African states that had once been ruled through indigenous military systems no longer controlled their own fate. Colonial borders replaced fluid frontiers. Foreign law displaced ancestral authority. The age of sovereign queens commanding independent armies was over, not because the systems had failed internally, but because the rules of power had changed faster than resistance could adapt. Yet disappearance is not the same as defeat. Queen Amina's campaigns left behind fortified cities that outlived her name, embedding expansion into the geography of the Hausa world. Even where her chronology blurred into oral memory, the political logic of her reign endured. States grew because rulers understood that security demanded strength. Dahome's queens, including Hangbe, were absorbed into a monarchy that would later be dismantled. But the militarized discipline they upheld remained visible in the very structures colonial powers feared and dismantled first. In the Nile Valley, Amanirenas forced Rome to accept limits. Kush did not conquer the empire, but it preserved autonomy at a moment when others vanished entirely. That treaty lingered as an anomaly in Roman records, a reminder that even the most powerful systems could be checked by leadership grounded in terrain, patience, and refusal. Nzinga's legacy unfolded more slowly. She did not end Portuguese expansion, but she delayed it for decades, reshaping the political map of Central Africa in the process. Communities displaced by the slave trade found refuge under her rule. Her strategies, flexible identity, adaptive warfare, and relentless diplomacy became templates echoed in later resistance movements long after her death. Ya Asantewa's war ended in exile, yet her defiance survived colonial victory. British rule in Asante was never stable. Resistance continued culturally, spiritually, and politically, feeding nationalist movements that would later dismantle empire through other means. Her leadership transformed a military loss into a moral inheritance. What unites these queens is not triumph. It is consequence. Their wars accelerated change, forced confrontation, and revealed the true cost of power. They ruled without illusions, aware that authority demanded violence, and that violence extracted payment from those they governed as much as from enemies. History often prefers neat endings. Thus stories offer none. They end instead with contradiction. Queens who ruled through blood, yet are remembered for resilience. Wars that destroyed states, yet forged identities. Victories that faded, and defeats that endured. They did not fight to inspire future generations. They fought because their worlds demanded it. That their names persist is not because they were women who fought, but because they were rulers who understood war as a language of statehood, and spoke it fluently when silence meant extinction. The armies are gone. The empires have fallen. But the imprint of their decisions remains etched into borders, traditions, and memory, quiet proof that power, once wielded, never fully disappears.